Okay, our next speaker here is Ryan Sherstobitoff with Panda Security on stopping malware. I'll hand it over to Ryan.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Well, that's no good. What about now? All right, so this is not going to be super long, but we're going to talk about some interesting concepts. Again, my name is Ryan. I come from Panda Security, which is an antivirus company. And today we're going to talk about some of the changes in the threat landscape. We're also going to talk about what the heck is this herd intelligence, which happens to be the title of this slide. So, first of all, I want to talk about how things have changed. If any of you work directly with the underground or with hackers, you might know some of the information I'm talking about. But the first slide here is really talking about the growth of threats, and this is directly proportional to the capabilities of antivirus labs today. So, as you can see here, we have a tremendous growth from 2006 to 2007. We're talking about a strategy that's intentional. From our intelligence group within Panda Labs, we've been analyzing some of these underground trends and how they've emerged over the years. And we see that I think in 2006 there was about 200,000 threats. Now, prior to that, we were seeing 50,000, 60,000, maybe for the entirety of the year. So if you look at it from an antivirus standpoint, we had seen a change in evolution, and we'll talk about in a minute why a volume of such threats is even important to when you're talking about security. So when you look at this, you have in 2006 200,000 threats. What were those threats consisting of? Okay, they were viruses, they were worms, they were Trojans. What were their sole intention or orientation when being released into the wild? Because and all of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the days of Melissa and all those funny blaster worms. So those were all in the past, but I'm sure because everybody's reading the news these days, it's all economical, it's all hacking for profit. So this is a little bit about the underground, because we actually had produced a secret FBI briefing document that talked about Russian mafia becoming quite involved in the hacker and malicious code ring. So if you look at it, we've been analyzing several different groups. Now, back in 2006, it's emerging into 2007, there's a team called Infected. They had created, I think they were one of the first groups to create, a serious economical damage to the financial community. There's a Trojan, it was called NetHill Limbo or something like that. It was half botnet, and it was half sort of like, banker Trojan. What they were using for techniques were complex HTML injection before it was keyloggers, right? And again, we'll go back to the slide because I'm kind of going off track, but I want everybody to understand the techniques that they're using now, which are directly proportional to economic fraud. So before they would capture people's passwords with keyloggers, well, okay, the banks came up with anti-key logging technology, okay? Well, that worked quite effectively, but now what they're doing is, I guess you could say, man in the browser or ghost in the browser attack. They're inserting a BHO, which is injecting fields into a person's bank login process, which an uneducated user would not know. So that you get like a username, password, and all of a sudden it's asking for a social security number or it's asking for a PIN. So the common, mother, grandmother, even my dad wouldn't even really know what that is. They say, oh, okay, I need to put this in. It's extra security. But unfortunately, a hacker group is obtaining that. But it's actually a serious threat where we have been having conversations with law enforcement. In fact, we had a conversation with the assistant director of the FBI, and his response was that they're becoming more clever. They actually had something called Operation Bot Roast, which was designed specifically for shutting down these huge bot rings that were half economic fraud. But back to this slide, in 2007, you can see the threats had increased exponentially. We're talking about millions. So who can guess the figure on what is the percentage of those threats that were directly related to economic fraud? Anybody? It's not 100%, but let's analyze this on a daily basis. So you have 4,000 to 5,000 brand new threats. 60% of that is oriented towards hacking for profit. So we're talking about a banker Trojan. We're talking about targeted threats that result in a data breach. You must have seen the case with Hannaford, right? Everybody heard of the retail chain up north, got their wonderful servers hacked. Or you must have heard of the TJX Maxx breach. And I've been blogging a lot about data breach prevention, and it comes back to a commonology of what are they actually using in this process. So there's a theme in this case where they're using traffic capturing malicious software, but it's targeted. So when we go back to the volume of malware, the tactic is to seed the industry with so much noise that targeted threats go under the radar. So something that infects 2 or 3 hosts will never be detected. So we'll talk about ways that the community are attempting to address this. We're going to talk about in-depth antivirus analysis here. So we're going to talk about some of the ways that were not so effective and some of the ways that are effective today. So now is an interesting thing. I will give you some statistics from a research study that we had conducted. We had done a consumer population, we had done a corporate population. We really wanted to understand what the prevalence of cybercrime is today, because obviously it's all over the news. People didn't really have a whole lot of tangible proof in terms of what is the ratio of unnoticed infection points. What is the ratio of something when you're doing a security audit for SOX compliancy or PCI or HIPAA? We recently had an interesting conversation with one of the chief architects at Kaiser Permanente, one of the largest healthcare systems, and their response was, well, you know what? They didn't really have too much in place to find unnoticed or undetected data breaches. I mean, if you're working on an antiquated model, which is AV does not work, and we'll see in a minute why even some of the more revolutionary protections don't work as well. And we'll go into the model where we're getting the security as a service, which we'll get into some other stuff here. So let's look at this study here. So this is a study that we did with over 1,200 companies from around the world took part. So the workstations were scanned using an audit service that at that time we're working on prototypes to increase detection capacity. We had an objective because we saw at the tail end of 2007 that there's a whole lot of brand new malware. So we decided to come out with something following a concept known as herd intelligence. I won't tell you what that is yet, but let's take a look at the criteria. So the criteria of this audit here is that we wanted to test all the PCs that were part of this audit to see, okay, we only considered a PC infected if they had active processes or active objects loaded in memory, which were related to a virus, a Trojan, something or another. Then we also then tested with the Windows Security Center whether or not protection was enabled, disabled, up to date, and therefore that was the criteria, and the findings will come out in a second here. So the second thing is there's several different antivirus vendors that were tested here because we wanted to see if there's a common theme or pattern amongst virus-based defenses, or signature-based defenses, how we call it. So across this here, there's 40 different ones. For the purpose of the study, we decided to only rate the top leading vendors in the world as to different infection ratios while up-to-date defenses. So we only took into consideration PCs that were scanned once were considered infected during that period. So we didn't take into consideration latent Trojans, adware, cookies, spyware, anything like that. We wanted to find out specifically active. So active is the most dangerous threat because it's currently doing something harmful to the PC. So the research results at the end here, I don't think will surprise a lot of people, but we found 72% of the networks. We're not talking about 72% of the PCs. We're talking about 72% of the companies who were running top antivirus products that were using signature-based defenses. We're talking about cataloging viruses using basic string comparison, as you would find with when lab engineers reverse particular malware samples. So 72% were infected. There's obviously 28% not infected. By the way, this number has increased. This is actually information from mid-2007. What we've seen now is there's around 6,000 different companies who've been tested now, and what we found is an increase in certain types of malware. So themes of infections we've seen is downloader Trojans, Trojans that go and download additional crimeware. We've seen identity theft Trojans. We've seen I guess you could say, sophisticated rootkits. And what we've released on our research blog at research.pandasecurity.com, we have given some information about the prevalence of certain types of threats. There's a blog posting by a colleague in Spain talking about what are the most prevalent types of malware strains today affecting corporations. Actual infections found on actual customers. So this is kind of the evolution and trend, but it seems that the viruses of the old days have pretty much phased out. The propagation methods are no longer self-propagating. You don't see a whole lot of worms these days that are self-propagating in a large number. Yes, there is occasional worm infections here and there, but that's not the major news of the day. What we're finding here is that web is a common infection vector. We're talking about drive-by downloads. So you would go to a site, it's infected or laced, but here's the interesting thing. I was recently talking and giving commentary on mass SQL injections. So have you guys heard about the recent one that happened about 2 weeks ago that I think they did about 500,000 sites generically by inserting a piece of JavaScript code which ultimately resulted in attempted exploitation of the endpoint. So the question is, how can you exploit 500,000 servers that quick and that rapidly without, at first they thought there was maybe a vulnerability undisclosed within IIS, but it was found that they're using advanced search strings in Google to find vulnerable sites. So there's actually this query you could use and load into a tool that would reveal sites that could be potentially attacked. So then they would put this crafted SQL statement and insert these particular types of code. So it shows to the example that even good, legitimate websites today, the good side of the internet, you don't have to walk down the dark side to be infected. So again, looking at the cybercrime underground, the trends that we have, our researchers have seen, is picking sites that have less security in mind, like seasonal websites, football sites, stuff like that where the person isn't like extreme on security and they might have unsanitized SQL code. So those are the evolutions we have seen. This was just a quick snapshot of different vendors who were found infected. Yes, we're on this list here, but that's with some other type of product that didn't take advantage of greater visibility. But this is to show, based on the study we had conducted, there are some research papers available. I'll give you the blog at the end here, which talks about a lot of this commentary. So now we want to know, why is 72% networks infected? So what might be going through your head is like, okay, well, that's great. Well, how are they getting in? How is it bypassing current defenses I have. And there's a very good reason for that, because it all goes back to the way that traditional antivirus is designed and what's actually deployed in today's world. So who is familiar with host-based intrusion prevention? That's good. A lot of people are. So first of all, we want to look at how are the bad guys getting in. So this is a summarization of how they're actually getting in. So first of all, we have what is called silent epidemics. So that means this is silent and unnoticed. Before it was fame and notoriety, but if you want to be a cyber criminal, essentially you can go to an online forum and purchase Trojans that have a service level agreement attached to it. There's shopping carts, there's a whole business behind cybercrime that is actually fueling the economy today. So there may be a hyped recession with the United States, but actually there's a cybercrime underground where there's a lot of Trojans, worms, and all sorts of stuff being developed. So for example, they're actually designing and selling auto phishing kits where it'll compromise a server for you, build a phishing site, and then start targeting people. So all of this stuff can be purchased. Next door neighbors, next door companies can pay $1,200 and become a cyber criminal. Because it's now financially motivated, everything pretty much is a strive towards profit. So they'll do anything to bypass current defenses. Firewalls, IPS, IDS, antivirus. And we'll see in a minute exactly how they are evading antivirus, because it all goes back to the flawed model where what Andrea Keith at Yankee Group, a leading firm, was talking about, that vendors need to plan for 10 times more the malware today because signature-based solutions are not effectively working. And I'll actually have a diagram that we describe it from really a top-down model. So to summarize this last thing here, the sophistication has changed. So targeted attacks, so we had this anti-fraud analysis service that found this thing back in 2007, which ultimately resulted in some 60-page document that was delivered to the FBI and Interpol. But it's really the volume of what they're creating and adapting to specific controls within the financial community. So it's no longer a generic piece of malware. It's really oriented towards that specific company. So if I wanted to break into, let's say, the whole Staples network, what would I do first? Well, the theorem behind the TJX Max breach was somebody did a web crack at a local wireless and somehow did a privilege escalation attack or elevation attack on some of the credit card processing servers. So most likely they're capable of exploiting a vulnerability. They may have not patched the systems well enough, but once getting on the network and exploiting the systems, they can then plant specifically designed malware that will intercept and capture traffic relating to the applications installed. So you're not really going to see too much about just some general keylogger or Trojan on the system. This other point here, quality control for testing against vendor signatures, is also fairly important in terms of the hacker's success. We see what they're doing is that they're loading all the engines, including online engines, and testing to ensure that before they resell their creation, it's bypassing signature defenses. The last thing here is virtual machine detection. They can obviously detect when they're inside a virtual machine, then take advantage of the architecture of a virtual machine. So we're seeing a lot of those. There's a good percentage, I would say 2 to 3% of malware we see on a monthly basis has some form of VM detection included. So let's take a look at the antivirus model here. This is basically a failing model. So we describe the traditional antivirus model as top-down. The reason for top-down is it describes the flow chart on what labs do. So if you ever wondered what it was like to be in an antivirus research lab at, let's say, a Symantec, McAfee, or even Panda Security, this is what is currently being used. The first step here is malware samples received. It goes into the lab. Then the next step here is to create a signature or a rule. Now, the problem with that is that they don't have automated procedures that are able to extract and create vaccinations on everything that comes in. Imagine if you do the math and you have manual manpower behind all of this, you get 4,000 threats per day, and let's say the common and average antivirus lab has maybe 200 engineers, you're getting around a 65 to 70% detection ratio based on the ability and manpower to process everything. So we're talking about vaccination, creation, extracting malware. There is some cases where they're starting to automate the procedures, but the part that we're saying here is that there's no way to correlate that information and make it intelligent enough to then deliver a vaccination at the end. So at the end here we have the update service, which then distributes the updates to all the nodes. So looking at the weaknesses here, you have no global threat detection or intelligence. So yes, they do collect automatically samples from the wild. There is some degree of automation, but what do we do with this afterwards? How do we correlate information that happened in China versus what happened in the United States and use that effectively to produce a vaccination without humans trying to aggregate the knowledge? That's the weak point there. Some people might argue, well, yeah, antivirus labs have to have automation involved. Yes, they do. But what do they do with the information that all comes back in? Intelligently extracting vaccinations back into the community is key here. So the products don't necessarily benefit from all the processing in the back end because architecturally, signature files, the more threats that are released in the wild, the greater the size. So it ends up becoming an impact on the endpoint. So if you got like some 80 meg signature file, it ends up creating a heavy footprint. And with some of the antivirus products out there, there's definitely concerns about that. So how do we produce something that's relatively small and light but still has detection capacity of a high volume? And that's where we'll talk about herd intelligence, of putting everything from the endpoint into the cloud and just providing an MD5 hash analysis. And I'll talk to you about something that we had coined, nanotechnologies, and how that applies to the antivirus space. So running down here is that back in the labs here, there isn't a whole high degree of proactive protection in here. So we're talking about, let's say 60% they can automate. But what about the really complicated rootkits and packers that keep on and constantly evolve? Imagine packers that are custom and you don't have the decryption routine for that. So how do you deal with that when you have no way of understanding or getting access to that? You ever heard of crimeware as a service? Anybody? Well, that's server-side polymorphism. We call this crimeware as a service. Instead of having polymorphism occur on the desktop, we're talking about malware servers that automatically do that. They give malware on demand. So someone's infected with something, it can automatically morph and change its variant and deliver that down in a small binary to the client. So it can constantly change. The challenge here for antivirus researchers is they don't have access to the polymorphic engine, right? So they have no idea what the logic is involved with that. So, endpoint polymorphism or malware that is polymorphism, they use emulation. So emulation is the common technique that they use today to be able to detect and analyze a polymorphic virus. But if you're dealing with something where the offspring is coming from a server and it's all on an on-demand basis, it makes it a lot more difficult. So what we're embracing here is trying to educate companies that they need to take a holistic approach. We're talking about proactive security using HIPs to be able to detect the variance of the server-side polymorphism. So what we're seeing today is that signatures, if you look at any other common vendor site, you can see that the average detection ratio in a DAT file that downloads today, just look at the daily updates, is around 250,000 to 500,000. So it's not entirely reflecting everything because we saw 2 million threats last year. Why aren't they on the signature file? Why are we finding situations like Hannaford infected even though their antivirus product says, yes, I'm up to date, I'm working? And they got an update like 2 minutes ago. there's obviously a flaw. It may be that the labs are quite advanced, but they're not exactly extracting into the products. And that's something that we had as a problem too. And because we're not like a super huge company, we decided to, let's reinvest some of our revenue back into solving this issue. So actually, there's a research note written by Andrew Yakeith on some directions we need to take to solve this problem. So down here is just a couple of other things. In some cases, a complete signature with inoculation can take weeks to deliver, especially if it's very sophisticated, like a rootkit that needs to be deactivated. So that's just kind of a general flow here. So let's take a look at what is herd intelligence. This is something that if you do a search for Andrew Yakeith herd intelligence, you'll find some wonderful papers he wrote about what do we do if malware increases 10 times the amount it is today. If we can barely handle 4,000 samples per day, we obviously need to take a different direction. So the idea here is to create an automated data center of hundreds of servers, and the pillars here is watch, act, and watch, decide, and act. So the first thing is deploying sensors around the globe to give a better visibility. So we're talking about receiving information and queries from sensors. Let's say we had 10 million different endpoints, part of a large interactive honeynet that had the capabilities of sending back suspicious behavioral traits. That's the first thing, to be able to watch the community at large and see the infection. So it's kind of similar to the concepts of grid computing, cloud computing, which we're taking intelligence from the community. So it's gathering data about malware and goodware. So it's important to understand that part of this model is to gather badware traits as well as goodware traits to be able to correlate something new against a massive database instead of doing it locally on an endpoint, which does have a lot of resource consumption involved. Why don't you just take it offline and provide it in an automated fashion, but with hundreds and hundreds of servers? Second part here is correlating all the information it gathers. So that's important too. So here's a good analogy I give to press. They ask, okay, what does that mean? So what does it mean by correlating and aggregating information from the community? So what we're seeing here is that, let's imagine as part of the cybercrime evolution, hackers test their stuff. They don't just generate a virus variant and release it into the wild. What they do is they test it against all different vendors, including any online service. So that would include ours. So what they would do is they test that, behavioral traits would be captured and then relayed back to this herd intelligence and stored as a record. So the very first creation would be stored as, the time and context when the process was running, the suspicious characteristics, and all of the information necessary to give a detailed description of that process. We don't know what it is because we don't have any information to correlate it against. So let's say he, a couple months later, decides to create a vaccination, not a vaccination, but creates a brand new variant of this, right? But it all is based on the original source code, which a lot of these malware creators use source code of other viruses. So what it then creates is a new behavioral trait, which is then sent back up to the cloud, right? So all of this stuff is stored historically. So now it's capable of correlating against a goodware list, which is some 20, I guess you could say 20 million different processes up there, and then correlating it against the massive badware list to make calculations as to whether or not this has a high degree of danger potential. And on our research blog, we actually have a video that shows us taking Notepad and a real Trojan and determining what is the highest degree of relation to GaleBot. So we throw Notepad in and it's like 0% relation to GaleBot. Then we take a variant that's probably 30 times removed from GaleBot and throw it into the pile, and with automated analysis and reverse engineering, with the correlation involved here, it was capable of determining an 80% possibility that this had some relation because it was correlating the byte blocks within the source code itself against all previous variations of Galebot collected. So we're talking about 20 years of knowledge aggregated from all variants of viruses and being able to correlate, hey, is this a family of some virus we saw a couple years ago, but they're using the same propagation techniques but a different payload, which is economically motivated. So all of that is including loading IDA Pro in an automated fashion to extract out certain strings to create a detection routine. So this is all part of the process of generating automated cleaning routines. The third part here is it acts. So what does it do? It then answers the queries from the agents that are connected back to herd intelligence. So when we're talking about the definition of nanotechnologies, what is that? Well, we're talking about something that's able to scan memory in 30 seconds and talk back to the cloud, and we're talking about sending MD5 hashes of every process in the system back up there, instant correlation. Then we get into the answer thing. So it follows the phases of watch, decide, and act. So someone doing a 30-second PC scan, which was part of the consumer study, some behavioral trait would then be uploaded and sent back to the cloud. Whether we had any knowledge of it, whether it be unknown, good or bad, that information is stored. So further information into the future can then be used to backtrack and find brand new variants of malware. So we're talking about greater visibility into the threat landscape. So let's take a look at how this works here. So from a bottom-up model, we're seeing unknown programs seen in the wild. It reports its program and its context, the time it's running, the relation of other processes running at that time, and certain characteristics that are extracted using heuristics technologies. So this information is then sent back to the cloud, and then exceptions or vaccination rules are created and then informs all the other nodes. So we're talking about automated aggregation of information. So the strength of this model here is global threat detection, automated signature creation in less than 2 hours without having to involve humans. The objective behind this was detect 10 times more reliably than we are now with 10 times less the human effort. And a couple of things, this is really going down the line of security as a service. So no longer is it providing DAT files to people on a daily basis. We're talking about a constant feed or a constant subscription back to the cloud, which would provide instantaneous updates. Because it's scalable computing or grid computing, you're not reliant on the endpoint's performance overhead. So we're not talking about relying on, well, is that PC powerful enough to contain millions of threats, or is it powerful enough to be able to analyze some very advanced rootkit? So in this case here, you're collecting a lot because you can add more machines. Question? Well, if you're talking about products that take a direct advantage from this, the evolution that we're seeing here is traditional antivirus products moving to a security as a service model, meaning you're putting like a 2 meg agent on the PC, but all of the analysis and detection is done on a server center rather than being done locally. So if you look at it, what really causes the performance overhead is having the signature-based defense, the desktop firewall, DPI, which is deep packet inspection, HIPS protection. That on average takes 10 to 15% overhead on the PC. Taking that intelligence away from the endpoint and moving it to a cloud, because in most environments it's always connected. So we're talking about moving everything back into the cloud and doing an automated analysis. So all the complicated routines that a virus scanner would have to do, all it has to do now is just the basic signature detection. Everything proactively is done within an infrastructure that can be scaled. So more malware, the better we can handle.
So it would happen once or twice a day that it would connect to this, and then it would be complete. So then there would be a certain period of time that you could exploit the machine until it was cleaned the next time?
No. What it does is, let's say, and the actual endpoint security technologies are not advanced to a point of being always on, always connected. So what we're talking about here is, imagine if you're able to do, and this is in the future. This is not something that's present right now, because I haven't seen it with any other company. We're not there ourselves as Panda, but what we see is having the ability to interact in real time without creating a large amount of network traffic back to the cloud, so we can instantaneously identify, okay, so we have a suspicious file, can we send the MD5 to a middleware server that does batch processing, right? So you would at least get extraction from the cloud on a daily basis, which means millions of threats. So if there's something new, then it would then inform that node and say, hey node, we just found out from the community of users that there's a brand new piece of malware targeting you, so I thought I would let you know. So that's kind of where it stands today. The future really is having a file-level system interceptor that has the capabilities of doing real-time analysis on each process without sucking up the network bandwidth and interacting back and forth with the cloud during the entire antivirus scan. And that's obviously a challenge because, one, you don't want to have a huge amount of chatter back to the internet. So somehow architecturally it has to be done through a middleware server and then batch processing done. So that's a difficult thing to do. We're not there yet, but the platform to be able to provide this is there, right? A data center of 500 servers capable of analyzing everything that comes in and producing vaccinations with maybe 4% of it requiring human involvement. So that's kind of where we're at now. So here's exactly some statistics here that I can tell you, because we actually had deployed a herd intelligence model back in late 2006 in limited prototypes. So this is exactly the data processing capabilities of herd intelligence. So currently to date, 4 million PCs are being monitored around the globe as part of a high interaction honeynet. Over 11 million malware samples have been classified automatically. Over 100 million programs analyzed. That's badware, goodware. Over 340 million correlations performed. The key here is that doing the automated correlation, the advanced heuristics, the static unpacking, all of that you can't do in real time on a PC because that's a huge performance overhead. Because 95% of malware today is packed. 40% is custom, where it's not a commercially available packed routine. So we have to create generic unpacking routines, and trying to do that at the endpoint is difficult. Yeah. I haven't heard of that, but I'd like to hear about that. Yeah, so what was the question?
Are you guys unaware of offensive computing Saffron utility, which is a generic unpacker?
Yeah, I haven't heard of that, but I don't work directly with the research lab, so some of my colleagues are probably involved in generic unpacking, but we are developing generic unpacking routines. We always participate in various virus conferences. Our technical director at Panda Labs is always going in the community as well. Sorry, he was talking about a tool from offensive computing. I think it's called Saffron. It's basically talking about generic unpacking. So generic unpacking is definitely a challenge, and it's all about putting it efficiently into products. So if you do have a generic unpacking routine, it's definitely important to take into consideration. So just a quick last couple of stats here. How am I on the time?
Still got 20 minutes.
Oh, wow. That's a lot of time left. So last couple of things here is over 340 million correlations performed, over 6 billion records in the database. So this is talking about the amount of malware that has been collected over the years, which is now in the database. So the last point here is these are the stats that I had received from Panda Labs from last year. 94.4% of all malware detected in 2007 comes from herd intelligence. So we're talking about that was what was automatically classified. obviously there's a percentage that had to be classified with human effort because some of them were quite complex, the server-side polymorphism, the rootkits, etc. So the last thing here is a new but necessary layer of defense. So some of the benefits here is the global visibility into the threat landscape, reducing reaction time, on-demand audits of virtualized networks. That was kind of left in there because I was kind of a slide taken here from a virtualization conference I was at. Locating unnoticed infection points that currently slip through the existing defenses. Real-time protection against targeted attacks. So if you're being able to detect malware on lesser PCs than currently with the manual process, it's a lot better. All right, well, that's all I have for you today. I know I gave a huge data dump here and a lot of information. And if you have any questions concerning stats or other clarification, I can get those from Panel Labs. I don't work directly on the technologies. I'm Chief Corporate Evangelist, obviously, but my email is ryans@us.panasecurity.com. The blog that I currently commit myself to is panasecurityus.wordpress.com. So we're talking about data breaches, and there's another blog, research.panasecurity.com, which contains cutting-edge information. The Panelabs blog is panelabs.com. Thank you.
As corporate evangelist, if you would be able to comment at all on the race to zero situation.
Sorry? I'm not familiar with the race to zero.
It's a contest that's going to be at DEF CON this year.
Okay.
Polymorphing malware code and passing it through signature detectors of various antivirus companies. Based on your comment that, hey, we never get to look into how they're doing it, I would think that it would be a good thing, but a lot of antivirus companies, I'm pretty sure, but it's been focused on keeping someone from your company as coding that as a bad thing.
Well, I could tell you one thing here is it all goes back to the testing standards here that are currently being used in the market today to rate the effectiveness. So obviously taking currently known viruses and passing it through signature-based defenses and essentially saying, okay, well, you missed this virus, so therefore you're not effective. So I don't know the details of this challenge, but essentially testing not just the signature, but testing the proactive side as well, testing the different measures of different antivirus products. So not just signature basis, whether or not we can find this polymorphic virus with a signature. Also, can we find it with heuristics? Can we find it with HIPS-based solutions? So it needs to be taken into consideration the entire holistic model, not just a portion of the vendor's product.
So perhaps the only real problem is you think they're beating a dead horse, attacking signature-based.
I would say so, beating a dead horse, because we know that signature-based defenses are only as good as being able to provide the vaccination and detection routine. So because a lot of it today is not automated and it's quite manual, it results in not a high number of detections. So I would say an appropriate test would be, let's take into consideration generic unpacking, let's take into consideration behavioral analysis, behavioral blocking, system heuristics. All of those things need to be used when effectively testing, because that doesn't give a real reality of whether or not we could stop that virus. So it may not be included on our signature, but we sure as hell can detect it using other means. So that's my response, to that, even though I have no idea about the details. Any other questions?
About the virtual machine detection, what's the goal of that? Is that to break out the guest OS or to disable itself
That would be one reason with the virtual machine detection. Another one is to, I haven't seen specifically a sample that does this, but to adapt to knowing it's in a virtual environment, therefore exploiting maybe the hypervisor, but that's kind of really the trend we would see in terms of VM detection, but it's usually meant to evade from being put into a sandbox or a honeypot that's using virtualization. So it's able to then say, you know, I'm not going to run in this because that's not my target. So that's what we mean by VM detection, but obviously if they can detect that they're in a VM, they can then detect and how to best take advantage of that situation. So, question?
Is her intelligence ready for deployment?
Well, I can tell you this, Panda Security has already deployed that. Andrew Yakeith was mentioning a couple of different other vendors. I think it was like Previx and Sana Security. It's really how mature is the platform and how does the technologies take advantage. I can tell you today that we're not 100% on the product side interactive in real time with the cloud, but we have deployed several different technologies. One was what we call nanoscan, where I said where you could scan a PC in 30 seconds and it would take all the MD5 hashes and send that back to the cloud for correlation. Some other products, you know, especially one that we're announcing on Monday, which is a security as a service product, does take advantage from the cloud, but it is extracting information in terms of a megapav sig is what we call it, which then applies to the endpoint. But true interaction and true real time is yet to come, where there's a brand new process executing and we're able to analyze it in real time, then interact with the cloud. Obviously, architectural considerations is that going to create a hit on the PC or performance overhead, especially if network traffic is going back and forth. So that's something that we need to design that takes into consideration those issues. Yeah. Right. I know, that's a good question. Yeah, but if you're specifically signing communications or validating them where it's kind of like a one-way hash of what's actually being sent back to the cloud, then the answers cannot be spoofed. So that was something included in the nanoscan product, which sent one-way hashes of the information back to the cloud, so it wasn't able to intercept or impersonate. And there's a whole technical document on exactly how that was achieved, but yes, there is going to have to be some things that need to be included at the endpoint. But guess what? If you're not doing antivirus scanning, DPI, or behavioral analysis, or all this other stuff, that's a minimal overhead. So if you're just solely focusing on ensuring that the data stream is encrypted with, let's say, SSL and one-way hashes, then it doesn't really put a lot of overhead. But if you got all the other bloated technologies on there too, then yes, design considerations need to be implemented around that. Any other questions? I think I ran out of my time here. All right. I'll be around for the rest of the day if you have any other further questions about this. Thank you.